I just wanted to take you through what SBC is, how you would go about designing a social and behavior change project. We'll go through some examples and then we'll have a Q&A session. So just to get us started, I just want you to think about, especially now that it's January, New Year's resolution time. So many of us, want to adopt a new behavior. And we want to change something, right? So it's usually around exercise or eating better or something super drastic. So this is usually what it looks like. We want to get up earlier and we want to eat healthier and we want to do all of these fantastic things. But then this happens in reality. Yeah. So a few weeks in, sometimes a few hours in, we find ourselves going back, regressing to our behavior, our old ways. So this is what is called the intention action gap. And essentially, this is what social and behavior change is really all about. So what we're really trying to do is try to figure out why people have positive intentions and desires to do something, and they end up not doing it. So this principle applies at many levels. So at the individual level, as we just saw in the example, but it could also be a collective community level behavior, right? So, maybe a community intends to get better at recycling. Yeah. And then for whatever reason, that community is just not able to get it together. So there's lots of stuff that happens in there, and that's what social and behavior change specialists focus on, try to uncover and try to design projects that would help to close this gap. So, we will get into what social and behavior change is, but I just wanted to highlight and underscore that it's social and behavior change, not social behavior change, which is something that irks me a lot when people leave out the and, because that means something completely different. So social behavior change would be, the act of changing a social behavior. So, doing something communally. But what we are talking about is we are looking at changing behavior at a societal level as well as at an individual level. Yeah, so that distinction needs to be quite clear. So something to bear in mind is that social and behavior change or communication, behavior change communication, or any of that stuff is not new. I started the timeline in the 60s, but probably there's examples that are even older. But the easiest evidence to find and good examples to find that I could come by is from starting in the 60s, and you could see that back then the idea was very much like you need to scare people into doing things. Yeah. So show them graphic images of the consequences of what would happen if they don't adopt a certain behavior. Yeah. You still see this at times with cigarettes. Still, you'll have them on the cigarette packages, but there's lots of evidence that fear just leads to denial and, ostrich effect, and people just there's reactance to the message. You can use fear, but it needs to be done very carefully. And basically something called response efficacy needs to be very high. So people need to really believe and trust that the solution you're offering is going to help alleviate whatever the barrier is to the behavior. Then we got more into like information, education, and communication in the 70s, which is kind of like trying to tie it back to, trying to raise awareness and trying to get people to reflect. And so lots of use of posters and flyers and very, very knowledge heavy. And then in the 80s, people thought, well, okay, we can't be preaching at people so much. Let's try and sell and not tell. So let's try and be more market focused about how we disseminate health messaging. That has some impact. Still quite popular. Social marketing is used quite a lot. Still as a methodology, but it still wasn't quite enough, and it still isn't. And in the 90s, we started to understand a little bit more about what the determinants are of behavior, um, and focusing more on behavioral determinants. So trying to understand people's attitudes, self-efficacy, and all of that good stuff. And then, again, you could see the focus is very much on the individual. And I think that shift really happened in the 2000s, where we saw an acknowledgement of the need to look at the person within a larger context. So the person within their community or society. And so you see a bit more of that social and behavior change communication and looking at community engagement as a strong vehicle for change. And now, or since the mid 2010s until now, SBC has become a lot more sophisticated, placed nicely with other areas like human-centered design, behavioral insights, and so on. So it's become a lot more multifaceted, and you see that a lot of interventions will not just look at the individual, the community, but also like at systems level change and how to make sure that the person is able to access services and not just stop at messaging, essentially. So what is SBC? So in a nutshell, it is an evidence-based, theory-driven approach to identifying factors that influence people's behaviors, and um, addresses them using the approaches that are most likely to produce positive change. So the key words here are evidence-based and theory-driven. So everything that we do within SBC needs to lie in solid research and solid translation of what the research is saying into intervention design. This then means that we need to use a multi-theory, multidisciplinary approach when we are trying to understand an issue and when we design interventions. So SBC is not, it's kind of like field agnostic in a sense. So you're basically supposed to bring in the area, the technical expertise area that makes most sense for your current project or the problem that you're looking at. So that can be lots of different things. So anything from social psychology to anthropology to comms. So it really depends on the issue. And the larger the lens of looking at an issue, the better, in my opinion, because it helps you to uncover different angles of what the problem is. I mean, humans are very complex, so they might have I'm working on a project right now where people are super positive about a behavior, but they're just not doing it. And you're like, okay, what is really happening here? And try to uncover what the issue is. So if you do nothing else, use the socioecological model. It is simple and wonderful because it brings in that multidisciplinary thinking automatically. If you understand that an individual lives within a family, which is within a community, which is influenced by institutions and structures which are then influenced by policies, that really helps you to already get a very nuanced understanding of all the different factors that might influence a behavior. So one doesn't really need to be an expert in all of those fields that I've shown before. You can simply just look at the topic using the socioecological lens. And the bigger the team is that you work with, and if you're lucky enough to work with colleagues that come from different schools of thought, that's just an advantage. If you want to get a little bit more technical and want to know a little bit more about the various behavioral drivers, and want a little bit more theory, I would highly recommend the behavioral drivers model from UNICEF. It's a lovely 150-page or so document, but it's really good to give you that sort of social and behavioral science 101. if you want to dig in a little bit more on the theory part. And it's, you will see in that document the relationship between this diagram here, which is showing how somebody gets from point A to point B in carrying out a behavior, and the relationship with the socioecological model. So it becomes quite succinct there. And as you can see, one can be influenced by, for instance, a behavior could be influenced simply by the communication environment that somebody lives in, right? So they might just not have access to specific communication sources. So I would highly recommend looking more into that. So one might ask themselves, why bother with SBC to begin with? Why not just do stuff and test it out and see what happens? Well, there are at least 5 key reasons. One is that we really want to focus on behaviors because we want to focus on what people need to do. Yeah. So what is it? What is the end goal? What is it that we want people to be doing? The second is that if we work from a theory-driven, evidence-based place and approach, we're going to automatically increase the quality of interventions that we're designing. So we're not just like stabbing at the dark. We have a framework, a blueprint that we're working with, and that will also help us to retrace our steps, right? So if we have a plan, we have a theory that's informing our decision making, we can always go back to this theory, this framework, and then backtrack and try and assess what we did wrong. Doing thorough research helps us to check our assumptions. We're all guilty of it. We, especially if we've worked in a specific area or topic for a long time, we tend to think, okay, well, we get it, so we know what these people need or whatever. So, but, using an SVC lens just forces you to check your assumptions. It helps to cut waste because you're not rolling out things that are not going to work. And you're focusing on people, which is essentially why we do what we do, right? So, again, just like a simple question to ask yourself, if you look at these two men, do you think that they would respond in the same way to an intervention? Probably not. So their demographic data is identical, but we all know that these men are very, very different in their likes and dislikes and their habits and what have you. So again, taking an SBC lens just helps us to tailor our messaging. Even if it's the exact same demographic, they will have different needs, they will have different ways in which they look at things. Another good reason to use SBC is that the UN now sees behavioral science as one of 5 key areas for innovation. So it's, I wouldn't say mandated, but it is highly encouraged that all UN agencies adopt behavioral science in their approach. And so it's very beneficial. I wish they would have said social and behavioral science, because behavioral science kind of tends to make it seem as though we just want to focus on the individual. So, but the point is that we should be taking a theory-driven, evidence-based approach to how we design things. In terms of frameworks, I am not married to any specific framework. I don't, it doesn't really matter to me. They all come down to the same thing. These are the key steps we're supposed to be following. We should understand the issue, which is basically research. Define, which is distilling what the research is saying, to identify the barriers and facilitators. We then identify the correct behavior change techniques. That's where we're designing the intervention. We should pre-test it. And then I'm also skeptical about scaling. We can get into that a little bit later. I'm not sure one can really scale one intervention into many contexts because the context is different. So, but I'd welcome a discussion about that. But this is the point, really, is that these are the key steps. Lots of organizations have frameworks. They will either be 3 or 5 steps. Choose one, use it. Doesn't really matter, because the reality looks like this. So it's not going to be a linear process. You're going to have to go back and forth and iterate and try and understand the problem over and over again until you get to a conclusion. If you absolutely must have one, then I would suggest the SBC flowcharts from Johns Hopkins. It's from Breakthrough Action, actually, which is a project by Johns Hopkins CCP. So, if you want one to get started and to sort of understand what the steps are like and sub-steps, that's a good one to look at. By the way, I will be sending an email after this to the participants with various resources that you can consult. So let's take a look at an example. So let's just take a very simple one. Trying to get parents to read more with their kids at home, right? So it seems, our initial reaction would probably be like, let's do some sort of campaign or whatever, and then they will know, and the end. Of course, it's not that simple. So even if you look at something like at-home reading, you'll see that there are several actors that could influence a parent's ability, decision to read at home. So, these are potential actors. So if Dewi is the child with whom, we want Reza, her dad, to read more, there are several people that we could work with to potentially improve Reza's ability to read more at home with Dewi. So we can map these actors back into the socioecological model. So, Reza's, in this instance, the individual whose behavior we want to change. Noor is I think that was her name, his sister. So she represents the family level. The teacher, Basia, represents this community and institutional societal level. And then Budi is our policymaker that could also have an influence in the end goal of Reza reading more with Dewi. So if we then do our research and focus on researching the one behavior, so that he should be reading a story with Devi every day to promote her literacy skills, this, you could then uncover that there are several factors that could influence his decision. So from your interviews with him and focus groups with several dads, you could find that maybe time, work schedule, the books not being in local language, his role in the household / gender norms, his own reading ability, and the price of books could all be factors and reasons why he's not doing this behavior. And so we would then map these barriers back to the socioecological model, if you will. So we would see things like time and work schedule and reading ability are all factors at the individual level that we would want to change. And then, things like books not being available in the local language, books being more expensive would represent things that we might need to change at the systems and policy level. And then, things that like the gender norms, and by that I mean, for example, how people might perceive what the role is of a dad. So a dad is not, yeah, exactly, Natalia. So a dad is not supposed to be doing these feminine things or whatever. So this is something we might want to work at the community level on. Excuse me. So SBC is then really about designing interventions that would remove these barriers, right? So just if you look at the color coding, so a solution that we might find for the time barrier that he's experiencing is that we would help him to organize his day better to fit reading into his schedule. Yeah. We might also help the family design a reading schedule. We might, have him tell stories instead of feeling the pressure to read a book. And then we might also want to work with private sector providers to look at providing more books in the local language. And we might also want to work with government. So there's lots of different things we could do to facilitate a behavior that might seem very simple, but it really just depends on what the barrier is. And so, as you can see, also from an organizational point of view, you might then see that it's with your resources, your team skills, your budget, there would be certain things that you would be able to, certain areas where you'd be able to intervene and others where you will not. So some organizations would just have the capacity and the resources to basically look at things at the individual level, right? So they might just decide to work with dads and groups of dads. And some organizations are more focused on systemic issues. And so they might be working more with policymakers and with government on removing some of the structural barriers. They may also want to work more with teachers or schools to facilitate some of the behaviors around reading, at home reading. So I think it's really important just to remember that we can use SBC to change behavior at the individual, community, societal, and systems levels. So I'll just take you very quickly through some examples at each of these levels. So one is Coach and Pilo by PSI. I really love this project. So this is it's Coach and Pilo is like this fictional aspirational character that supports the project, actually kind of creates coaches, so other men who are HIV positive, and they support men with personalized coaching, emotional support, and guidance. And so these peer coaches are very powerful because they understand the challenges themselves firsthand because they're also HIV positive, and they also understand the stigma around being HIV positive. And so they're the way that they measure the impact of Coach and Pilo and the peer coaching methodology is adherence to HIV treatment, because that is the end result that they're looking for, that the men take their medication regularly. So I think they have lots of data online that you could look at. An example of a project that works at the community level is Buck Buck Gang by it's one of Girl Effect's brands, and it's a Facebook group that empowers young girls in India to discuss sensitive topics like reproductive health. And they create a safe space for conversation. They provide emotional support, and they also offer information. And they work with a number of health professionals as well. So beyond the community support, they also offer linkages to service providers. So that's a good example of like something that addresses barriers at a community level. At a societal level, so anything to do with like social norms, social influence, that sort of thing, usually large scale media is really effective, because people change when they see other people changing, essentially. So, and then large scale media often opens the door for having conversations with each other and debates about a certain topic. So that's why it tends to be quite effective. So an example is, for instance, the drama East Los High, which aired between 2013 and 2017. And it was the first ever all Latino cast, drama cast in Hollywood's production. And the show tackled key issues like adolescent sexual and reproductive health. And they actually managed to double traffic to stayteen.org, which is a Planned Parenthood program. And yeah, they basically just managed to get a lot of traction and discussion. It's also an Emmy nominated show, so it also had it was just a very glossy production. So, it was a good show. You'd enjoy watching it anyway. But it had this additional impact in that it had this connection with Planned Parenthood. And there's also a few papers written about it, and you could look at Population Media Center for more detail on that. And then At the systems level, you also see behavioral science applied in many different ways. One project is MMC Sustain, which is it's actually managed by Genesis Analytics in South Africa, the South African Department of Health. And one of the things that they this project has lots of different layers, and this is just one example of the many layers within it. So this is about helping helping nurses report adverse events that result from voluntary medical male circumcision. So it's really important to keep track of these unwanted episodes, basically. And the intervention is not just a poster. I know it looks like that, but the poster is one of several layers within the intervention. So this kind of acts as a reminder. But obviously there's, sessions between the health care professionals themselves, the way that the management structure is set up. They also did a lot of work around that when meetings are had, changing the culture around reporting adverse events, so that people don't see it as a failure, but that it's more of like a perk if you report something that could potentially improve the service. Great. So I talked a lot, and I'll just share some key highlights. So SBC is multidisciplinary. It's evidence-based and theory-driven. We have a very wide toolbox of things that we could do and use. And we don't only work at the individual level. I really want people to stop thinking that. And it can be applied to any field. So I hope that, with some of the examples, I think health tends to dominate just because it's the sector that's used behavioral science and SBC for the longest, but we're seeing that that's going to change, and it is changing over time. And yeah, so, I will be starting on a project that's looking at SBC within the space of social protection. So, you could use it literally for anything and everything. Okay, and with that, let's start our Q&A session.